Syria. Bronze Age. 1457 BC. Typically, defeated men were enslaved at this time. Valuable manpower. But Thutmose I unleashed the wrath of the gods on the Syrians. Armageddon. After the ignominious takeover of the upper parts of Egypt by the Syrian-born Canaan rulers, Thutmose I shook off the yoke of the oppressors and reconquered Egypt. Now the new, 22-year-old pharaoh is leading a campaign north, across the Gaza Strip. The previous pharaohs did not know how to kill and stood for life. They preferred to enslave. Back then, people threw stones at each other and attacked each other with small axes. Daggers and throwing knives were very popular. Bows had a range of 50 meters and the arrows were sharpened. Bronze is generally a flexible metal. Sharpened weapons became blunt after a few blows. The people were small, but robust and had to beat themselves up for a long time until someone dropped dead. But the usurpers, the Syrians, also brought new weapons from Mesopotamia to Egypt. The composite bow, a powerful weapon with an increased range of up to 90 meters and corresponding penetrating power. The horse was not yet widespread in Egypt at that time, and the warriors were afraid of it. The horse-drawn chariot enhanced the effect and enabled rapid movement across the battlefield. The pharaoh adopted these new technologies and armed his army of archers. His army of archers was supported by just over 200 horse-drawn chariots. 10,000 warriors, Egyptians, Nubians, and other slaves follow him north on an expedition beyond Egypt's old borders into enemy territory that is still unexplored. To Syria. He crossed the Gaza Strip into Palestine and met an equal enemy force there. Thutmose did not go undiscovered. The king of Kadesh has gathered the Syrian allies under his leadership in Megiddo. The enemy knew he was coming. Thutmose knew that the enemy knew he was coming. But the enemy didn't know that Thutmose knew that the enemy knew he was coming. Thutmose followed the sea over the coast and approached Megiddo from the southwest. The Carmel Mountains stood between him and Megiddo. The Megiddo Forest, part of the Carmel Mountains, could be passed via an arch to the left and right. To avoid looting and devastation in the cities of Yaknim and Tanakh, the king of Kadesh divided his army into 5,000 warriors each. Both cities were only 10 kilometers from Megiddo and could be reached within an hour's walk. This allowed him to form a wide front and definitely stop the advancing enemy. To defend Yaknim and Tanakh, he did not need chariots and left them behind in Megiddo. So he thought, the king of Kadesh, divided his army and sent it to Yaknim and Tanakh. The pharaoh did not know the cartography of the area and could only lead his forces along the old paths. But Thutmose found a way through the mountains, an unreal place from ancient Babylonian myths. He found a gap, a chasm of sharp stone, lousy stalactites from above and nasty stalagmites from below. Despite the skepticism of his advisors, he sent his force through the gap, one after the other. The horses and chariots in particular posed a problem. He chose the middle path, the Gorge of Ara, the Valley of Death. They left the gorge in the morning and passed the Carmel Mountains in the evening. The pharaoh remained undetected. He camped outside Megiddo and obtained information. He quickly understood the situation. He had found himself between the left and right flanks of the enemy army. Syrian messengers rushed west and east to Yaknim and Tanakh. He couldn't catch them all. In a few hours, the army stationed there would rush to Megiddo and encircle and destroy the Egyptian forces on all sides. Megiddo, a huge fortress with walls 6 meters thick, situated on an earthen rampart. In this short time, completely impregnable. But Thutmose had an idea. Just as the Syrian king divided his army, he would do the same. He divided his army. With his mightiest warriors, he went against the army from Tanakh. His weakest men, at that time, should not be underestimated, many with disabilities. But useful as an archer, he left behind for a surprise attack. A previously unknown tactic. The army from Tanakh proved to be strong. The enemy had new types of exotic units. rider cavalry, and heavy horse-drawn chariots. Pharaoh fought at the forefront, leading the chariots. The chariot enabled him not to run around the battlefield like a poor slave, to shoot at the enemy from a distance with a bow and arrow. And Pharaoh was good at it. When the Egyptian force met the enemy, Thutmose sat on the flank with his chariots. There he faces the Syrian elite, early spear cavalry and heavy horse-drawn chariots. These soldiers had bronze armor and helmets, in contrast to the normal archer infantryman, who was often only dressed in rags. The pharaoh's light chariots were inferior in direct close combat. These were made of flexible bamboo-like material, and were simply tied together with string. Sometimes, if you look at it closely, this tied-together structure would simply fall apart or even burst into flames. The heavy Syrian chariots, on the other hand, consisted of a wooden chariot hammered together and had deadly scythes on the chariot wheels. They were intended directly for close combat and were manned by spear throwers. But the pharaoh knew how to use the lightness of his chariots and kept his distance while firing arrows at the enemy from a distance. Since most of the Syrian chariots remained in Megiddo, the Canaanite elite was at a disadvantage due to the numerical superiority of the Egyptian chariots. One Syrian elite after another was forced to flee. Meanwhile, the Egyptian force engaged in a long-range duel with the Syrian force. Both parties threw stones, arrows, and spears at each other. When Pharaoh took over the enemy's flank, he called for the attack. His troops followed his example and stormed the enemy. With a single charge, the opposing force collapsed. The pharaoh relentlessly pursued those fleeing to Megiddo. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battle line, the enemy force from the west, from Yaqmim, approaches Megiddo, ready to stab the pharaoh in the back and create a gap to Megiddo for the fleeing allies. But Pharaoh has taken precautions. He told the rest of his troops to hide behind a hill. When the enemy advances from Yaqmim, his warriors are supposed to climb the hill and literally pin the enemy down. His reserve army consisted of the poorest of the poor from Egypt, and in an open battle with their self-made bows they would be no match for the better-equipped enemy force. But the pharaoh understood the advantages of the bow like no other and knew how to use his reserve archers. Once over the hill, the Egyptians surprised the astonished Syrians and began Armageddon. They didn't have much, just their bows and arrows, and unleashed a hail of arrows with unprecedented power. The surprise attack was a complete success. Unlike the Egyptians, the Syrian army had shields and could withstand the fire. But advancing was out of the question. The men didn't dare run into the arrow storm. It was hailing from all sides. The Syrians were literally nailed into the ground. Those who were lucky lost an eye. The Egyptian reserve did not consist of the strongest archers, and their arrows were also of the worst quality. Simple sharpened wood without a spring. You had enough for that. Good and cheap. The Syrians were hit by hundreds of arrows and pinned into the ground until they finally died miserably. A massacre. As if the heavens would open up and swallow you all. Every attempt to advance failed. God's wrath struck you from above. The battlefield filled with nailed. The screams could still be heard in Megiddo. The Syrian force from Yaqmim regrouped and made the final charge. Despite bitter resistance from the Syrians, their forces were severely wiped out and they had to flee to Megiddo in desperation over what had happened to them, calling for Amun. When the screams of death were heard, the gates in Megiddo were closed. Individual soldiers were pulled over the wall by tying their laundry together. The Syrian force, totaling 10,000 men, was completely wiped out on both fronts and had to retreat to Megiddo with its remaining survivors. The survivors continued to resist and were able to withstand the Egyptian siege for 7 months until they finally surrendered. Thutmosis the pharaoh captured great wealth when he took over the city. Many horses and chariots, gold, some rare copper armor, and much more. In the Bible, Armageddon also refers to Armageddon or Armageddon in the Revelation of John, the place of the eschatological decisive battle in the war of the great day of God Almighty. In the broader sense, the term in theology refers to the eschatological decisive battle. For this reason, Armageddon is the symbol of every battle in which, when the need is greatest and the believers are oppressed, the Lord suddenly reveals His power on behalf of His afflicted people and defeats the enemy. When God grants a small handful a glorious victory over an enemy who vastly outnumbers them, it is a kind of Armageddon. Perhaps the prophecy, the final decisive battle between good and evil in Israel, has simply not yet been fulfilled. If you don't want to miss the next episode, subscribe and leave a like. In this sense, until next time, and have fun at Armageddon.
Anything of value from the dead!
Today! Yes, Commander!